Let's talk about the Roman Empire. A civilization so powerful, its legacy still shapes our world today. But what if I told you that from its very beginning, the seeds of its destruction were sown not on the battlefield, but in its treasury? The story of Rome's fall is often told with tales of barbarian invasions and political intrigue. But the real, underlying cause is a fascinating economic thriller. It's a story of money, power, and a trap of their own making. To understand this, we need to go back to the basics of Roman money. Unlike our modern economies where money can be printed, Roman currency was what we call commodity money. Their most important coins, the silver denarius and the gold aureus, were valuable because they were made of actual silver and gold. The amount of money in the entire empire was directly tied to the amount of precious metal they physically possessed. You couldn't just create more money out of thin air, you had to find more gold and silver. This simple fact is the key to understanding everything that follows. So, if you need more gold and silver to make more money, where do you get it? For the early Roman Republic and the burgeoning empire, the answer was simple and brutal: conquest. The Roman legions were not just an army, they were the engine of the economy. Every new territory they conquered was a massive payday. Think about the Punic Wars against Carthage. Rome didn't just win, they seized unimaginable riches. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, he brought back so much gold that its price in Rome dropped by a quarter. Later, Emperor Trajan's conquest of Dacia, modern-day Romania, was another huge injection of wealth, funding massive building projects across the empire. This system of conquest-fueled economics worked brilliantly for a while. Each victory brought in a flood of tribute in the form of gold and silver coins from the defeated peoples. It brought in new mines to exploit for even more metal, and it brought in millions of slaves, a captured labor force that worked the fields and mines, freeing up Roman citizens to serve in the ever-expanding army. This constant inflow of cash and resources paid for the legions, funded the grain dole that kept the Roman populace happy, and built the spectacular monuments we still admire today. The entire system was built on a simple, powerful loop: conquer, get rich. Use the riches to conquer more. It created a vibrant, expanding empire that seemed unstoppable. But what happens when the conquests stop? By the 2nd century AD, under emperors like Hadrian, the Roman Empire reached its maximum territorial extent. From the drizzly moors of Britain to the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, the empire was vast, and frankly, too big to manage effectively, let alone expand further. The age of glorious, profitable conquest was over. The border solidified, and just like that, the tap was turned off. The massive, regular injections of gold and silver from conquered lands simply stopped. This created an immediate and catastrophic problem. While the income from new conquests vanished, the expenses did not. In fact, they grew. The empire now had thousands of miles of borders to defend against peoples the Romans called barbarians. This required a massive, permanent, and very expensive professional army stationed all along the frontiers. On top of that, a sprawling government bureaucracy had developed, with countless officials and administrators who all needed to be paid. The lavish lifestyle of the Roman elite and the subsidies for the urban population in Rome also continued. So you have a situation where the money coming in has drastically shrunk, but the money going out is increasing. The government was facing a severe fiscal crisis. They had fixed, even rising, costs but a suddenly stagnant money supply. The economic engine of conquest had stalled, and the empire was left with bills it couldn't pay. They were caught in a wealth trap of their own design. The very system that made them rich and powerful a reliance on finite precious metals, acquired through expansion, was now strangling them. They had to find a new way to pay the bills, and their choices would set the empire on a slow, irreversible path to collapse. How did the mighty Roman Empire pay its bills when the gold mines ran dry and the treasury was empty? They couldn't just print more money like we do today, so they came up with a seemingly clever, but ultimately fatal, solution: debasement. Imagine you have a gold coin. What if you shaved off a tiny sliver from the edge? You still have a coin, and now you have a little extra gold. Now, imagine doing that on an industrial scale. This was called clipping. But the emperors took it a step further. They started mixing cheaper metals, like copper and tin, into their gold and silver coins. Think of it like watering down a drink. The coin looked the same, but its actual precious metal content plummeted. The most famous example is the denarius, the silver backbone of the Roman economy. At the height of the empire, it was nearly pure silver. By the late 3rd century, some denarii contained less than 5% silver, It was basically a copper coin with a thin silver wash. The rest was just filler. At first, this seemed like a genius move. The government could take one pure silver coin, melt it down, mix it with a bunch of copper, and mint 10, 20, even 50 new coins. Suddenly, they had enough money to pay the legions, fund public works, and keep the imperial bureaucracy running. It was a financial magic trick. They were creating money out of thin air, or so they thought. But you can't fool people for long, especially when it comes to their money. Roman citizens, from the merchants in the bustling forum to the soldiers on the frontier, weren't stupid. They could feel the difference. The new coins were lighter. They didn't have the same heft or shine as the old ones. A quick scratch would reveal the reddish copper underneath the silver coating. People quickly realized these new coins weren't worth as much as the old ones. The trust that underpins any currency began to evaporate. This is where the real disaster begins, the wage price spiral. Let's say you're a baker in ancient Rome. A soldier comes in to buy a loaf of bread, and he pays with one of these new, debased denarii. You know this coin is mostly copper, not silver. Are you going to sell your bread for the same price? Of course not. You're going to demand more coins to make up for the lower value of each one. So, the price of bread goes up. Soon, the price of everything goes up. Wine, olive oil, pottery, you name it. This is hyperinflation. As prices skyrocketed, the soldiers, who were the backbone of imperial power, started to complain. Their pay was suddenly not enough to buy what they needed. So, they demanded a raise. The emperor, terrified of a mutiny, had to agree. But how did he pay for this raise? He had to mint even more debased coins, flooding the economy with even more worthless money. This created a vicious cycle. The government would pay its soldiers with more debased coins. The soldiers would then spend these coins, and merchants, knowing the currency was junk, would raise their prices even further. This forced the government to debase the currency again to meet its payroll, which in turn led to even higher prices. It was an economic death spiral. Imagine living through this. The money you had saved, maybe your entire life's work, became worthless practically overnight. The value of your savings was being inflated away by your own government. This destroyed the very concept of saving. Why put money aside for the future if it would be worthless by next year or even next month? People lost all faith in the currency and the government that issued it. Commerce ground to a halt. Long-distance trade, which relied on a stable and trustworthy currency, became almost impossible. The consequences of this hyperinflation were profound and reshaped Roman society. With the formal, monetary economy in shambles, people had to find other ways to trade. They went back to basics, resorting to the oldest form of commerce, bartering. A farmer might trade a sack of wheat directly for a pair of sandals. A craftsman might exchange a pot for a few chickens. While this worked on a small, local level, it was incredibly inefficient. For a large, sophisticated empire, imagine trying to pay your taxes with a flock of sheep or trying to provision an entire legion through barter. It was a logistical nightmare. The complex, interconnected economy of the Roman Empire began to break down and fragment. The world effectively got smaller. This economic retreat also fundamentally changed social structures, particularly in the countryside. Large landowners, the wealthy aristocrats, stopped accepting rent from their tenant farmers in the form of cash. Why would they want a pile of worthless coins? Instead, they began demanding payment in kind. This meant tenants had to pay their rent with a portion of their crops, livestock, or even with their own labor. The tenant farmer was no longer just a renter. He was becoming tied to the land and to the landowner. This was the beginning of a shift away from a monetized, market-based agricultural system and towards a more feudal-like structure, where land and labor were more important than money. The great estates became self-sufficient little kingdoms, producing everything they needed on-site because trade with the outside world had become so difficult and unreliable. This localization of the economy was a direct result of the currency collapse, and it further weakened the central authority of the emperor and the unity of the empire itself. The debasement that was meant to save the state ended up helping to tear it apart from within. The failure of the currency and the collapse of the economy weren't just abstract financial problems. They struck at the very heart of Rome's power. Its military, the legionaries, the backbone of the empire, found themselves in a desperate situation. For centuries, they had been paid in reliable silver coins, a symbol of their service and their wealth. But now, the coins they received were almost worthless, a mix of copper with just a hint of silver. Unsurprisingly, the soldiers became disillusioned and mutinous. What good was a salary that couldn't buy bread? They started demanding payment in forms they could actually use, land to farm and food to eat. This put an immense strain on local provinces, which now had to support the legions directly from their own harvests and territories, bypassing the central government's authority and supply chains. The financial crisis also had a direct and devastating impact on the state's ability to even field an army. Defending the empire's vast borders from Britain to the Euphrates required a massive and well-equipped fighting force. But with the treasury empty and the currency devalued, Rome simply couldn't afford it. They couldn't hire enough high-quality troops. They couldn't manufacture the necessary armor, swords, and siege equipment. As barbarian incursions along the Rhine and Danube frontiers became more frequent and more intense, the Roman military was a shadow of its former self, stretched thin and poorly supplied. Legions that once projected overwhelming power were now struggling just to hold the line. Often outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the state's inability to pay for its own defense was a critical vulnerability. To try and make up for the worthless currency and fund what little it could, the Roman state resorted to a brutal and self-defeating strategy: taxation. With coins having lost their value, the government began demanding taxes in kind. This meant citizens had to pay their dues not in money, but directly in goods, grain, oil, wine, textiles, anything of tangible value. The tax rates soared to crippling levels. This policy hammered the productive core of the empire, especially the curiales, or the urban middle class of merchants, craftsmen, and local officials. They were the ones who had to meet these impossible demands. Many were bankrupted, their businesses ruined, their properties confiscated. Faced with financial annihilation, tax evasion became rampant. People did whatever they could to hide their wealth and avoid the rapacious tax collectors. This environment of desperation fostered endemic corruption. Tax officials, themselves underpaid, would extort the populace, demanding more than was owed and pocketing the difference. Wealthy landowners used their influence to gain exemptions, shifting the burden onto those less able to pay. This created a vicious cycle. As the tax base shrank due to evasion and bankruptcy, the state had to raise rates even higher on those who remained, further fueling the crisis. The entire system of governance began to break down, corroded by corruption and public resentment. The bond of trust and obligation between the state and its citizens was shattered. People no longer saw the empire as a protector, but as a predator, and loyalty to Rome evaporated. As the central economy disintegrated, a profound shift occurred in the social and economic landscape of the empire. Wealthy aristocrats and landowners began to withdraw from the chaotic and dangerous cities. They retreated to their vast agricultural estates, known as latifundia. These were not just farms, they were self-sufficient fortresses. They had their own fields for food, workshops for goods, and even private militias for defense. On these massive estates, life could continue with a degree of stability. Insulated from the currency collapse and the failing state, they operated on a local, barter-based economy, trading goods and services directly without the need for Rome's worthless coinage. The latifundia became the new centers of power and economic activity. This retreat into self-sufficient estates fatally weakened the central government. The great aristocrats, secure on their lands and commanding their own private armies, no longer needed Rome. They stopped paying taxes to a distant emperor who couldn't protect them or provide stable currency. They stopped relying on the imperial government for justice or infrastructure. They became, in essence, local kings ruling over their own domains. The economic and political fabric of the empire frayed and then tore apart. The very concept of a unified Roman state, administered from a single center, was becoming obsolete. Power was no longer concentrated in the city of Rome, but was fragmented and scattered across dregs of these fortified estates throughout the provinces. The final fall of the Western Roman Empire is often pictured as dramatic barbarian invasions, with hordes sacking the city of Rome. But the reality is that the invaders were simply pushing against a structure that was already hollowed out from the inside. The empire's fiscal and economic core had rotted away. The central government no longer had the financial resources to support the massive military and political apparatus required to hold such a vast territory together. It couldn't pay its soldiers, it couldn't collect its taxes, and it couldn't command the loyalty of its most powerful citizens. The final waves of migrations and invasions by groups like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks were not the cause of the collapse, but the final symptom. They were simply taking over territories that the Roman state no longer had the economic or military capacity to govern or defend. The Western Empire didn't so much fall in a great battle as it dissolved. its pieces breaking away as the economic glue that had held it together for centuries finally failed.